In the early hours of the 8th of December, 2025, the southern area of Zaporizhzhia still lay within a pocket of stability. Two Russian K-52 attack helicopters flew at treetop level, holding an altitude of 15 to 25 meters, their speed maintained evenly as in previous sorties. They hugged the tree line, skimmed through narrow gaps between foliage and drainage ditches, vanished, then reappeared again along a familiar flight route. Inside the cockpit, there was no target lock signal. There was no tracking warning that forced a change in rhythm. For the crew, this was a standard low-level approach to support the forward line. Above them, outside their field of view, a Ukrainian reconnaissance UAV continuously followed the flight path. No emissions, no interference. The airspace ahead remained calm, but it was no longer empty. Ahead of the Russian K-52 formation, less than 3 kilometers away, lay a trench system and defensive positions clinging to the southern edge of Orikhiv. It sealed off the exit to an open field nearly 400 meters wide, a stretch of ground Russian mechanized forces would have to cross if they wanted to maintain the tempo of the morning attack. That was why the helicopters were pushed forward to the line. Flying low at 15 to 25 meters and holding 220 to 240 kilometers per hour, the K-52 could close in within minutes, fire S-8 rockets along the trench line, then break away before ground fire had time to adjust. When a point was exposed, an ATGM only needed to hold the target in the sight for a few seconds. This rhythm relied on a single condition, the formation not being kept under observation long enough to be tracked. During the early days of December, similar low-level runs had continued to pass through without encountering any clear reaction. On the HUD, the sky still read as clean. The approach cycle repeated often enough to become the default. This time, Ukraine did not intercept immediately. They allowed the Russian formation to remain low and continue advancing, entering terrain segments that forced brief climbs for observation. No warning appeared in the cockpit, even as the flight path was already inside a track being maintained continuously from above. At 0543, the Russian K-52 formation had closed in close enough to begin the deployment phase. Altitude remained within the 15 to 25 meter band, speed steady at 220 to 240 kilometers per hour, the flight path hugging the tree line in the same rhythm repeated in earlier runs. On the left, Ukrainian trench systems and defensive positions appeared in short segments, aligned precisely along the axis the helicopters needed to suppress to open the route to the open field behind. At a gap between two clusters of trees, the lead aircraft was forced to pull its nose up an additional 30 to 40 meters to observe. The airframe was exposed against open ground for a few seconds, then immediately pulled back down to low altitude. Inside the cockpit, the HUD remained clean. No target lock signal, no tracking warning forcing a change of direction. For the Russian formation, this was still read as a familiar approach. One more observation phase, and the S-8 launch phase could begin. Above, the Ukrainian reconnaissance UAV maintained a stable loiter, altitude unchanged, rhythm unchanged. The track was preserved continuously through each rise and drop of the K-52, following the same terrain-driven pattern. On the ground, concealed positions shifted into a waiting state. Around 0547, when the lead aircraft repeated the climb at a similar open stretch, a Ukrainian interceptor UAV departed its hiding position and cut downward along a shallow angle. The impact jolted the helicopter violently, rotor smoothness was lost, and lift dropped enough to force the pilot into an emergency descent, breaking away from the optimal flight path. Immediately afterward, the trailing aircraft climbed to observe and the escort accelerated to cover. From this moment, the approach rhythm of the Russian formation began to drift away from its familiar trajectory. After the emergency descent at around 0547, the Russian K-52 formation entered a new state. Altitude remained low. The flight path continued to hug the tree line, and speed stayed within the 220 to 240 kilometer per hour range. But the approach cycle began to lose stability. The aircraft could no longer execute a seamless approach fire break away loop, and instead had to insert additional observation phases to update the situation ahead. With each insertion, the overall rhythm of the formation stretched slightly further. The terrain forced the formation through fixed, repeating points, a gap between two canopy clusters, a bent drainage ditch, the edge of an opening field. At each point, the Ka-52 had to climb an additional 30 to 40 meters to observe, then immediately pull back down to the tree base line. As these phases repeated, the exposure time of the airframes against open ground increased with each cycle. By around 0550 to 0551, spacing within the formation began to change noticeably. The trailing aircraft slowed to maintain separation, the escort accelerated to cover, then was forced into abrupt corrections because the corridor ahead was no longer wide enough for the entire group to hold the same rhythm. These adjustments occurred in sequence, not simultaneously. Inside the Russian cockpits, no target lock signal appeared that was clear enough to define a specific threat. Radio communications began to show brief delays, commands no longer arrived simultaneously across the aircraft, and maneuvers were executed out of phase. Ukrainian light EW, low-level jamming, did not to cut communications entirely, but distorted transmission timing, preventing the formation from changing altitude and heading in sync. At 220 to 240 kilometers per hour, even small discrepancies forced pilots into sharp corrections to avoid overlapping flight paths, further stretching the cycle. Above, Ukrainian UAVs maintained their loiter with unchanged altitude and rhythm. The track was held continuously through the repeated climb and drop phases of the Ka-52, and exposure points formed into a terrain-driven sequence that could be predicted. From around 0552, interceptor and FPV UAVs appeared precisely at those exposure moments, cutting across the flight path or forcing the formation to make sudden downward pulls to exit potential firing corridors. These pressure actions were dispersed rather than concentrated, but sufficient to gradually degrade the ability to hold a stable flight path and to force the formation to prioritize escaping open segments rather than maintaining the approach. Ukrainian MANPADS teams remained in a waiting state during the initial phases. By around 0553 to 0554, when one Ka-52 was forced to hold an altitude of 60 to 90 meters longer over a repeatedly exposed segment, launch tubes were raised. A missile left the shoulder. Flares were deployed. The helicopter maneuvered sharply and exited the open ground, while the remaining aircraft increased separation to avoid overlapping paths and opened a temporary safety gap. From this point, the ground objective, a trench system and fortified defensive positions blocking a 400-meter field, was no longer approached according to the original plan. It was still there, but the Ka-52 formation could no longer sustain a stable approach rhythm long enough to deploy fire as intended. Each safety-driven adjustment further disrupted the combat cycle and narrowed the window for return. After the MANPADS launch around 0553 to 0554, the Russian Ka-52 formation could no longer sustain the original approach-fire-break-away cycle. Low altitude was still maintained, speed was still held within the 220 to 240 km/h range, but the attack rhythm fractured into short segments. Instead of driving straight down the approach axis to open an S-8 launch phase, the aircraft had to prioritize a sequence of preservation maneuvers, pulling down, changing heading, increasing separation, then briefly pitching up to check ahead. Time allocated to firing shrank, while time allocated to breaking away increased. From around 0555, the number of approaches along the ground target axis dropped sharply. The issue was not a lack of munitions, but the absence of a stable window long enough to hold targets in the sight. S-8 rockets required a relatively straight and close approach. ATGMs required holding the target for several seconds. Once the formation slipped out of phase, those conditions no longer appeared at the same time. When one aircraft climbed to lock a firing angle, the others had to increase separation to avoid overlapping paths. When the escort accelerated to cover, the corridor ahead was too narrow for the entire group to hold the same rhythm, triggering successive abrupt adjustments. Ukrainian light EW, low-level jamming, continued to introduce brief communication delays. In theory, this was not a loss of communications. In practice, it caused decisions to arrive off-timing. Commands to change heading and altitude were no longer executed in unison, and the formation began to fragment into pairs, selecting their own exit options. Once the shared rhythm was lost, mutual cover in low-level flight degraded immediately. Above, Ukrainian UAVs maintained loiter with unchanged altitude and rhythm. Continuous tracking made it possible to predict the next points where the Russian formation would be forced to climb. Between 0558 and 0603, interceptor and FPV UAVs appeared in rhythm-forcing directions, cutting across the flight path at open segments and compelling Ka-52 crews to pull down or abandon the approach axis. These pressure actions were evenly distributed rather than concentrated, intended to make each return to the axis more time-consuming and riskier than the last. By around 0605, the cumulative effect became clearly visible in the formation. Spacing between aircraft increased. Observation climbs appeared sporadically and out of sync, eliminating reliable cover during open ground transits. The formation no longer approached the ground target as a unified spear, but as pairs of aircraft slipping out of rhythm and preparing to leave the area. Around 0606, UAV footage captured the closing moment. A Ka-52 pulling off axis, flares deployed, while an interceptor UAV crossed close to the tree line along the escape direction. No additional decisive strike was required to change the outcome. The operational state alone was sufficient to close the engagement window. After that, from 0607 to 0612, the aircraft exited the area in pairs, no longer maintaining the original formation. Further approaches against the trench system and fortified defensive positions blocking the 400-meter field did not resume during the morning window. The ground objective still existed, but the low-altitude air assault had been neutralized in rhythm. When the Ka-52 no longer arrived at the right time and could no longer sustain a stable approach cycle, the ground plan behind it was forced to change pace, slow down, or shift to another layer of firepower to compensate for the gap that had just opened in the sky. By full daylight, the southern edge of Zaporizhzhia did not appear as an area that had been erased by a concentrated strike. The most visible change lay in the rhythm of helicopter appearances. The low-altitude flight routes that had once repeated steadily were broken into disconnected segments, then vanished from the morning battle space altogether. The trench system and defensive positions retained their basic shape and continued to block the 400-meter field, but the layer of support Russia expected from the Ka-52 no longer arrived at the right time and was no longer stable enough to open a window for mechanized forces. The breaking point lay in synchronization. Low-level jamming did not need to sever communications. It only had to introduce brief delays so that orders no longer arrived simultaneously, and at speeds of 220 to 240 kilometers per hour, the formation would drift out of phase on its own. Forced climb phases over open terrain then lasted longer, and exposure points turned into a predictable chain. Interceptor and FPV UAVs and shoulder-launched missiles did not replace one another. They overlapped in rhythm. Drones pressured the formation into repeated climb and drop maneuvers and heading changes, while MANPADS waited for the precise phase where the aircraft separated from the tree line at favorable altitude. The result was not a single sweeping blow, but the loss of the ability to repeat the operational loop. In practice, decisive outcomes often emerge from a worsening chain of conditions rather than from a single named moment. Low altitude was once seen as a shortcut. In this engagement, it became a narrow corridor where every heading correction had to be paid for with time and a slice of exposed altitude over open ground. The Ka-52 survives on the approach fire breakaway loop. Once that loop is broken, the ground target does not need to be erased immediately. It is enough that the helicopters no longer return on rhythm for downstream plans to be forced to change. On the southern edge of Zaporizhzhia, what was knocked out was not a single weapon system. What was knocked out was the operational rhythm. When that rhythm disappears, fire cover no longer arrives on time, and the ground element is forced either to slow down or to shift to another layer of firepower to fill the gap that has opened in the sky.